about a minute each speaker, okay? And after that we will end the session and we will allow questions from the floor. So, do we have the first speaker from the opposition?
The first speaker of the opposition repeatedly raised statistics which the opposition believes proves that economically the East and West are divided, Eastern producer and Western consumer. However, this proves that both the opposition's descriptions of East and West are interdependent. As again said, the world is united. Nations such as the U.S., who lack sufficient natural resources, $40 trillion of natural resources, they said, are dependent on nations such as Russia, who have $200 trillion in natural resources. And so they're interdependent, and that shows that terms Eastern and Western are no longer appropriate because this is between two nations. Additionally, the fourth speaker said that that although China and the U.S. are increasingly interdependent and continue with their argument, she stated that China and the United States are increasingly interdependent. This proves that although the opposition raised that China is an Eastern nation and the United States is a Western nation, these two nations are interdependent. Additionally, she said that there is currently tension between China and its neighboring countries. Yes, there is. There is the tension between China and Japan, and also between Japan and Korea, and those three nations, and also other Asian nations, regarding the possession of and control of small islands, because that will improve their economic wealth. This shows that there is tension in Asia, in what the opposition believes is the East. And also, Japan is seeking support from the United States against China and its problem with these islands. And thus, this proves that nations in Asia and nations in the Americas, and also what this team believes is the East and West, are interdependent, and thus these terms are no longer relevant.
I'm starting my rebuttal off with questions. Aaron, what was your speech on when you gave your 3 to 4 minute speech? And Sam, what was yours on?
Cultural and politics.
Politics?
Culture and politics.
Is McDonald's politics?
No, that's
Culture.
Economics. Culture?
Culture and politics.
All right, well, Aaron gave a point of view to Alistair that religion and food were not relevant to international relations. Well, that loses 8 minutes of all of their evidence. So I think that their 8 minutes on solely religion, which changes across the world, is irrelevant now.
Can we clarify that point, please? Would you mean
Clarify,
that? Yes.
She argued to Alistair while speaking, while he was giving his last 5th person speech, that religion, he was arguing about religion, and that it is irrelevant to international relations. That is what she said. And her whole speech was on religion. So I'm arguing that now her 4-minute speech is irrelevant to the entire debate. Because she said it's irrelevant. She spoke to Alistair that it was irrelevant.
Okay, if you want to go on very quickly, just very quickly.
What I said was irrelevant was the point that Alistair raised on religion, not my speech. I didn't specify that my speech was irrelevant, but that Alistair's point.
I would say religion is religion. And that's it. That's my point.
Okay. Anyone make it? Okay. Yes, position, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am very sorry, Mr. Alistair. What I was talking about was cultural, not culinary. So, McDonald's was not divided in Switzerland, but it was divided by Mr. Ray Kroc. He's the guy who made McDonald's really popular. So, through the globalization and also international marketing, the American culture of burger and any cheeseburger, right, was brought to Switzerland and the other part of the world. So what I'm trying to say is it is not Eastern and Western influences, but probably American culture influenced Switzerland and any Europe, or Asian culture trying to influence the European or American, like Sun Tzu, out of war. So what I was trying to say, politically and culturally, and do not forget that we are living in unity. Thank you.
Ladies, gentlemen, honorable chairman, I would quickly like to address that you specifically, all four of you specifically, use the terms Eastern and Western in your arguments when you're trying to debate that the terms are no longer relevant. I don't quite understand how that makes sense.
The proposition believes that it's pretty obvious to the entire members of the audience that it's impossible to argue this motion, which includes the terms Eastern and Western, without saying Eastern and Western.
Well, aren't you? But aren't you accepting the terms Eastern and Western by using the terms Eastern and Western and clarifying that there is a difference in Eastern and Western? Allow me to continue. And point of information projected. Christianity is also differentiated by culture. Allow me to ask you, how many of you have different cultural norms in one of the most popular Christian holidays, which is known as Christmas? Well, some families might have ham over Christmas, while other families might have other traditional foods over Christmas. Another point I'd like to make is McDonald's, as it's supposed to be a cultural point. McDonald's does aim to its consumers in different countries. I'm sure most of you are well-traveled, and most of you do understand that McDonald's does aim at different consumers, such as in China, they do have, Japan, they do have fish-based culinary Japanese McDonald's dishes that they serve to the Japanese consumer, which does reflects how the Japanese consumers would like to eat. Also rejected. Which also reflects on how they aim at different things. Another thing I'd like to specify is that how many of you study economics? The differentiation between consumer and producer, also known as consumer and supplier, is the differentiation in a market. Yes, we are in a global market, but we have a differentiation when it comes to who supplies and who consumes. By culture, the Western world consumes a lot more than the Eastern world supplies. This is only due to geographical advantages that the Western world has less resources and the Eastern world has more resources to supply the Western world.
Point of information.
Rejected. Another point I'd like to make is to Sam. The vegetation which originates in medicine, or where medicine was originated from, has to do with regional basis, with where these different herbs are grown. Although you have synthetic drugs are still originated from plant-based, which is also originates from the climate of the area, the environment of the area, and it's very heavily dependent on where the country is. Thank you.
All right. Seeing as the last computer ignored several points of information, what I would like to clarify what we were going to say. When we were using the terms Eastern and Western, we were using them ironically in order for not only for your understanding, but to see how they were no longer applicable, how there were holes in the ideas of the use, and how there are better terms. And for the market economics, the US produces a huge amount. China does too. But when you consider the Industrial Revolution, that was the blossom of production. Many of these Eastern or developing nations are going through this industrialization process. China, for example, is in the middle of their industrialization revolution. And Andy just pointed out how the spices and herbs are grown in special climates, special regions. Well, these are special regions, not special areas. You don't have a single climate in the east. You don't have a single climate in the west. Some of these climates are both found in the east and the west. So you can grow both crops there. And I believe someone said something about the Marshall Plan. That was Rachel? About the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan, yes, that was a U.S. measure. And it wasn't to support Europe. It was as an anti-communist measure. The U.S. was afraid of communism during the time period. So therefore, it was a measure, it was taking place in Greece and many Middle Eastern countries. The U.S. even implemented some policies of implementing dictators that could better control. And the East, Taiwan, for example, right next to China, Eastern nation, right? The U.S. implemented dictators there so who were better aligned with the goals of the United States and Europe. And there's something called the G20, 20 most powerful nations in the world. If you look at who's in there, we have the United States, UK, France, Germany, but we also have nations like Russia, our lovely Indonesia, Japan. You have a full slew of nations. You're not limited to just the West. It's very intermixed. And you don't just trade with the East, you trade with a specific nation. The U.S. is very dependent on China, for example, for a lot of their production. The U.S. itself does produce quite a bit. China just happens to produce more and produces the U.S. goods that they need. The NSA, for example, they weren't just spying on the East, they were spying on the West. There was a huge scandal when they found the NSA hacked into Angela Merkel, the German Prime Minister's personal cell phone. But Germany's a Western nation, so why would the United States tap into a Western nation? It was a global measure. Alistair pointed out how a lot of the McDonald's prices are, not prices, but portions and products, ingredients are Swiss. Portions are smaller. Yes, it's true. The ingredients, yes, they happen to be Swiss, but which is cheaper? Using Swiss product ingredients like beef, lettuce, or shipping these ingredients from nations like the U.S., Mexico, Canada, where they're grown. I mean, it's more economically profitable. That's why they do it.
Okay, hello, I'm Alistair. Again, I'm going to refute some points. Okay, so the opposing team referred many times to the subject of globalization in the world. I'd just like to present some facts on this. In 2010, which was the most recent study done by the National Census, the percentage of foreigners in China was around 0.05%, with the highest contributor being South Korea, which is another Eastern nation. So this proves that there is a much smaller percent of Westerners. No, I think we had enough.
Okay.
We did like 10. Okay, I would not exactly call this percentage globalization. Furthermore, when you move to a new country, you adopt the culture and ways of the people. If not in the first generation, but their kids, the second or third generation. Okay. So Sam also, well, I just like to clarify what Andy said before, which is that the terms Eastern, you were using the terms Eastern and Western quite freely. You could have referred to the West as being US and Europe, but you decided to use Eastern. We just saw it as being too many times to be statutized under irony, and it wasn't clear to me that it was irony. Also, Max, I'd like to say that I think you said McDonald's is cheaper in Switzerland. It is in fact much, much more expensive. That was the thing you said.
Clarify what I said. I was saying that it would be much more cheaper to use Swiss ingredients, not the prices themselves are cheaper.
This is in fact not true because Switzerland imposes its own ingredients on the companies on the food corporations which are in the country. So it's not just that it's cheaper, it's in fact more expensive. Switzerland was already the most expensive country in the world, so it's not cheaper to import beef from a cheaper country where it would be more in mass. But so it's because the country agreed that they would like to keep the products fundamentally Swiss, which shows that they do not agree with the globalization which is brought from America. Okay, well, I would just like to say that I identify myself as being a Westerner, and I would certainly not object to someone calling me a Westerner. If the public uses the term, it only makes sense for the politicians and governments to use the same terms in international relations. They represent us, so they need to be on the same page. I would not mind being called a Westerner. That Western culture, Western food, that's what I eat, that's what I am. So the public and leaders must not be detached, as they are the voice of the people. So they must use the terms which the public use, and in this case, the terms are Eastern and Western. Thank you.
Okay guys, I'm back. I just have two things to that question. First, Hannah said religion is irrelevant, thus Rachel's speech is irrelevant. Second, I still feel to rebut against my agreement on medicine because the names are just translations of the same medicine in the world.
Okay, you want to answer that? You want to do that something question? Okay, go ahead.
How fast?
Okay. Anyone else? Or rebuttals?
I'd like to just rebut what Aaron said about my point about China and US being interdependent. Yes, they are interdependent in two ways. In trade, because China manufactures everything quite cheaply, and US and China do have the second largest trade relation in the world. And they kind of have to be. US people who live in the US, they consume quite a lot, so and they need to find cheap ways of getting that, so they turn to China. The second way that they're interdependent is through combating terrorism. In the 9/11 attacks, 2 Chinese people died, and so China has been working with the US quite closely to combat terrorism. I'd like to just point out one of the ways in that recently, how there has been quite a lot of tension between the US and China. I'm sure everyone's heard about the dispute between Japan and China about the Senkaku Islands. They're islands in the East China Sea. US are duty bound to support Japan, and so US and China's relations have been strained as a result. So yes, China and US are independent, but again, they kind of have to be in one way. But recently there have been a lot of tensions, so.
How is the U.S. obligated to defend Japan?
As I understand that, they do have a treaty between the two countries that say that whenever there is a dispute over territorial dispute, that they have to actually support Japan in it.
Information.
Okay, you want to do information? Yes, just over here.
You stated again right now that in 2 ways China and the United States are independent, but you're saying that there's tension between China and the United States because of Japan and China's tension. But do you not agree that this is tension between nations and not the East and the West? Problems with this. Problem with this is that in cases like this, other
other countries do get involved. Sure, that China and Japan is between two countries. Then the US got involved, then Russia got involved siding with China, and then suddenly troops were sent to the islands, and there was almost the attacks going on. So, sure, it is. Sorry, what was your point again?
My point is that this argument is between nations, not between peace and us.
They do. It does get to the point where countries do have to take sides and speak out when these sort of disputes come about. I mean, it's about territory. It is quite a serious issue, and so other countries do have to come and take sides with their allies. So Russia took sides with China, and US took sides with Japan.
I would like to say that Russia was, according to the opposition, is an Eastern nation. But they cite history a lot. So, but historically, was Eastern, but it was moved to Western. Peter the Great, one of the best westernizers of Russia. Many Western organizations, or points of organization, like Congress of Vienna, when they decided the modern political boundaries of Europe, Russia attended. I mean, that was 1814, 1850. Yes, terms with East and West still apply, but I'm 100% sure that there were only Western nations there. So these terms are now becoming out of date. Rudyard Kipling's poem about the East and the West, how they're never meant to meet because they're never able to come to the same direction. That was in 1896. There were signs that these terms were starting to come out of date even then. Also, who was talking about the languages?
Did anybody comment on languages?
Yeah, okay, thank you. So, yeah, a lot of Europeans use the Roman alphabet. But when you go to these so-called Eastern nations, they're not really so culturally tied together. They're different alphabets. The Thai, the Chinese, and the Japanese all have different alphabets. I mean, isn't that just, they're not unified. It's much more based to the nation. How can these Eastern nations all be unified if they're using different language? Ignored. Thank you.
Two more rebuttals, and we've got to wrap it up because we're running out of time.
Yeah, I'll just make it quick. I'd just like to say that the fact that Russia used to be considered Western, but is now considered Eastern, shows that the terms Eastern and Western are developing and adapting to the modern world. This shows that they are still appropriate classifications as they're adapting to the modern world. So they're not out of date because Russia has now become an Eastern nation. They're changing, they're constantly moving, shifting, which means that we can still use them, they're still appropriate and still relevant in international relations. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have the last two rebuttals.
I just want to clarify that the understanding of international relations are the transaction of economics, political, borders, and culture. So, whether Russian become any part of the world, so it is international relation within national economics, political, and culture. Thank you.
Right, is that it?
I would just like to make a quick statement about Max's point when it came to languages. In the Western world, or in many European countries at least, most people can speak more more than one language. In the Eastern world, yes.
Would you please provide a source for that information?
Okay, I'll show you an example. In Switzerland, we have 4 national languages: German, Italian, French, and Romansh. All 4 are given in the educational system. Another example would be France. You have English and French. Germany, you have English and French. English and German, sorry. And they also give French in many of the German schools. A lot of schools learn Spanish. A lot of schools have many of these languages put into their system. You actually have an example on your own team of someone who is from the eastern side and learns another Eastern language, Chinese.
For new information?
Yeah?
I myself, coming from a school in Japan, have learned Japanese, English, and Spanish. That proves that I've not only learned an Eastern language, as you have mentioned right now, but I've also learned another Western language.
Yeah, but you come from a westernized school that comes from Western adaptations and is also a Catholic school which relates to Western religion. Then it's an all-girls.
Thank you for clarifying all the information about my school. I'd like to emphasize my school is not a Western school, but an international school.
School not primarily based in English is the offering of the curriculum at your school, not the International Baccalaureate, which is, from my understanding, originated from England. Anyway, I'd like to know.
Right, we've got to okay, last one final on the same line.
Sorry.
Sure.
Sorry. Is it that one of your parents is British? Is that, or American? Or
That's more of a personal matter, isn't it?
Oh, well,
Yeah.
nevertheless, I believe she's an international person, which would describe and explain why she speaks more than one language. So, that's just not.
Okay.
My point is that in the Western world, we have where many students are bilingual, many people are bilingual, and we focus ourselves around the languages that are in the Western world. Whilst in the Eastern world, many people are also bilingual, but they focus themselves on the languages in their Eastern.
Point of information.
No, rejected. Sorry.
I think we've got to draw a line, sharp line in the middle. Line in the middle, yes? Parting of the waters here. Okay, right, you've heard, I think you've had time to listen to arguments from both sides. This is now, we're going to now open the floor to your questions, okay, or questions from the audience. So we have a couple of hands up, okay, back, anyone, okay, and to Tash.
I've got a couple of questions further.
Right, stand up.
So, firstly, Alistair, you said that the debate is about international relations, and you said you'd be happy socially saying I'm a Westerner. So I myself, I'm from parts of the East, parts of the West. So what would you then call someone from the East and the West? Is there like a middle thing? Like, what are you going to call it?
In between us.
In between.
Right, okay, you want to answer that? Alistair?
So, sorry, if I understand correctly, you're from the East and the West?
Yeah.
Is that true? Okay, well, I would say that's a pretty small portion of the. Is that enough?
Yes.
I'd say that's a pretty small portion of the population which are from both. And in that case, yeah, which is third culture for kids. And in that case, I would say that it's not a large majority of people who are both Eastern and Western. So in that case, you would have your own category, unless you yourself would define yourself as Western or Eastern. Because in that case, I think it's up to where you live and where you've been brought up.
Okay, yeah, go on.
My other question is, so if you're talking about it socially, then restaurants. Would you then want a restaurant to be called an Eastern restaurant and a Western restaurant? Or what would you do with that?
Actually, in class, all 9 of us did decide we were avoiding the colloquial term. So yes, his point of referring to himself as a Westerner, not valid. But also Sam's point, humorous, I will admit, was not valid when he said, I wouldn't be able to find an Eastern restaurant. It was funny, yeah, but no, we decided as a class that colloquial term, the common term, we were avoiding. So both points are invalid. And that question was not addressing our question.
Okay, sorry. I have a question because I was just a general question, just to let you guys know that Iron Curtain point is not valid because the Iron Curtain in the Cold War was in between in between Europe, which was divided into East and Western. So I believe that the term East and West is for the whole world and not just for Europe. So that point is valid.
Hey. Okay, we'll take one more. Some other questions about yes, maybe back.
I was just going to bring up the point that the similarities between any two countries you would choose that you could consider East and Western would probably far outweigh the differences, and that a reinforcement and just constant emphasis on the differences between the two often reinforce really detrimental cultural perceptions. For instance, and I'm not going to nitpick your words, and I know it was an innocent mistake, but you confused China and Japan. Just,
Which team?
Andrea,
Your position.
just innocently. But and I'm not saying that's a part of your argument. I'm just saying that that is actually indicative of a huge cultural problem, which is the homogenization of really diverse cultures in the East into this kind of blob where they're considered interchangeable when they're really not. And I just wanted to say that sometimes the reinforcement of the idea of an East and a West can lead to
So
homogenization.
is there a question?
Yeah,
Am I
two
lost?
questions here.
Well, is there a question? Is it more
Yeah, I was asking what you.
It's more speech.
Yeah, sorry. But I was asking if you're going to avoid the colloquial terms.
Colloquialisms don't make sense. Is that right?
Yeah, but is it valid? Why do you think it's valid to avoid the colloquial or sort of social implications of it? Because I think that's pretty valid.
I did.
Sorry, what is?
Yeah, sorry again. I'm not saying that's invalid at all. I will use them colloquially in my life, but what we are debating is the international relations not involving colloquial. So I'm saying pertaining to this debate at this moment, there it is. Is that answers?
Okay, if you'll have, yes, question right at the back, sir, yes.
Yeah, just actually a question for both sides, because I would like them to clarify that what it says on the boards, you can see from here, it says being used in international relations. Could you clarify for me again what you mean by international relations?
What do you understand by the term international relations?
Would like to let them go first, sorry.
Oh, okay.
If they would like to.
What does the proposition understand from the term international relations?
At the start of the debate, we defined international relations as understanding.
You want to go for it?
Can you speak louder?
A bit louder as well. Let them hear it at the back.
At the beginning of the debate, we defined international relations as the language used by ambassadors and foreign diplomats, which is very formal and applies to economics, political, and governmental rule and economics, as well as culture.
So, is that fair enough? So that's all right? Okay, yes, yes.
Okay, I have a question for go through Hannah.
Opposition.
Can the other side clarify before maybe the next question? Because I was,
Say that again.
because I've asked both sides to clarify what they mean by international relations.
Sorry, the other side, yes.
Yeah, so we didn't find any faults in the definition of international relations. The way we see it, it's a branch of political science dealing with relations between nations, although we didn't disagree with their definition for the term, so we didn't find it necessary to clarify the meaning.
Okay.
So you mean exactly the same thing
Yeah,
as that?
it was pretty much the same. There was,
There's an agreement there between the two sides, okay? Yes, okay.
So Rachel and Hannah, would y'all rather be called Americans or Westerners?
Who is that question to? To the opposition. Would you rather be regarded as Americans or Westerners?
I personally would say Western because I mainly grew up in Switzerland, but I was born in America. So it's a mix of.
So would you rather be called from Switzerland or from Westerner?
Swiss American?
I would probably go with Western or third culture kid. I'm not going to specify because my parents would argue otherwise with me. So,
Okay, so and Hannah, what do you think? Would you rather be from America or from the West?
Are you American or are you Westerner?
Earlier in the week, I would have said I'm American. And then we had this debate, and then somebody said that when I first met her, she told me I'm half Swiss, half Portuguese. And they told me that Americans always say, oh yeah, I'm from the States. Like, that's just how they introduce themselves. They don't say, oh, I am these cultures. We just say, I'm American. So now, I was kind of...
Is America not your culture?
No.
Okay.
My dad is very strongly Irish, and he likes to...
But you grew up in America, correct?
I grew up in
Okay.
America.
Yes.
But I consider myself Western.
Yes, one question over here, yes.
I'd like to take the answer.
Okay, just very quickly.
Okay. We
You're next.
stated earlier on in the debate that the USA was part of the Western culture, and I did clearly list it, in case you missed it, I'm sorry.
So it's not a question of whether you'd rather be one or the other.
No, okay,
I'm
I'm saying.
a Western country.
Okay, so I'm saying, so if somebody calls themselves an American, then they're divided by countries and culture, not by the East and the West.
And that's
Because if you
So
say,
if somebody calls themselves American,
then they're
are
American, they're not.
They have
Okay.
different cultures. They might
Exactly,
have
different
cultures.
cultures. Countries are divided by different cultures.
At the end, I just like to specify. At the end of the day, they are still
I
part
reject
of the
it.
West.
Okay, we'll just stop for a minute. Let's take the heat out a little bit. Okay, question over here. Yes, this young lady over here.
I don't know if you still remember the argument you made earlier about how Western schools offers education on languages, on Western languages, and Eastern schools offers education on Eastern languages, or at least they put main focus on most of the Eastern languages. But as someone who's from China, who's been educated in China for 10 years, I'd like to offer perspective that English is a really, really important part of the Chinese educational system. And all of my peers, it's mandatory that they will be able to speak English. And even though most